Chapter 8. Coming Clean. The familiar electrostatic hum of the clinic's counter-surveillance measures kicked into life as Dr. Shikatika, who had been preparing to close up for the day, stared accusingly at his uninvited guest.
Well, look what the dung beetles just rolled in. I must confess I never thought I'd see you again, unless of course it was on top of an autopsy table. It would seem then that you have rather a lot of explaining to do.
Zithusula's mandibles involuntarily drew tight, an almost embarrassingly obvious tell of repressed guilt. When he finally managed to find his voice, the doctor could not help but feel that it had a mildly pathetic whine to it.
Please, Dr. Shikatika, I know that my deceptive behavior was an absolute disgrace, and believe me, I'm not about to try and defend my actions. But I honestly felt it was safer if you genuinely thought that our final experiment had been a complete and utter failure.
Interesting, but safer for who, I wonder?
Oh, come now, Doctor. Try to be reasonable about this. I couldn't risk Zitalia finding out that you were in any way complicit with this discovery, were she, Zikadia forbid, ever to learn of it. We both know the consequences of that would have doomed you to a fate worse than death. So I assure you it was with the very best of intentions that I decided to continue my work alone, within the relative safety and autonomy of the supernest.
Dr. Shikatika let out a contemptuous chirp.
I see. And I don't suppose the fact that there was no risk of me revealing something that I didn't know to begin with in any way influenced your decision-making.
The doctor began to shake his head wearily.
No, I really don't think you fully appreciate just how disappointed I am in you, Hithusula. Had you actually been willing to maintain a low profile, then I'm quite certain that the supernest would have been a more than adequate safe haven. And after all, when I recommended your clandestine defection, I certainly hadn't factored in that you were going to continue working on, well, whatever exactly it is that you have been working on. Zitalia's spy network is extensive, to say the very least, so you really should have known better.
Shikatika fell to a brief silence as if struggling to come to a decision.
All right, let's start right from the beginning, shall we? What was the real outcome of our last so-called failed experiment?
Zithusula eagerly nodded his head up and down agreeably.
Absolutely, Doctor. It's the entire reason I'm here after all. So right from the beginning, then.
Yes, but before we get into all of that,
Shikatika retorted irritably.
Perhaps you should first consider informing me of how much danger I am in of being unceremoniously dragged away by a Shihari interrogation squad.
Absolutely no danger at all. I give you my word, Doctor.
Your word?
The doctor said incredulously, as if someone had just told him that up was down and down was up.
Well, I suppose that will have to do for now. But anyway, unless I am very much mistaken, you were just about to confess all of your sins, were you not?
The scientist grimaced reflexively and then began to speak in earnest.
Of course, Doctor. Now then, in preparation for the final experiment, I constructed what I decided to call a mesh quantum brain. The MQB is not exactly an easy thing to build, especially without drawing any unwanted attention. The truth of the matter is, I had actually been working on it for quite some time before we had even met. It was perhaps not so surprising then that I conceived of the possibility that it could potentially be transcribed with a neural network via the Queen's quantum goo.
I see,
the doctor said, sounding singularly unimpressed.
But just out of morbid curiosity, I don't suppose you actually plan on telling me something that I don't already know.
Doctor, please, I am fully cognizant of the fact that I have let you down very badly indeed, but there is just so much that I need to explain.
Well, that much at least we can both agree on.
The Shihari scientist literally bristled with frustration, but very stoically managed to hold fast to his composure.
Seriously, Doctor, if you really just want me to leave, I'll go right now and you will never have to see me again. However, I can assure you that it is my sincerest intention to come clean and throw myself at your mercy. So, should I continue or not?
Dr. Shikatika remained silent for a long moment before replying.
I may well live to regret it, but I am genuinely curious as to just how deep the hole I now find myself standing in really is. So please, continue.
The scientist sighed heavily.
All right then, Doctor, I'll try my level best to keep this as brief and concise as possible. But please, you need to understand, this is highly complex subject matter, and as such demands a certain amount of intellectual rigor.
Well, I'll be sure to let you know if I can't keep up.
I'm sure you will,
Zithusula said resignedly.
So anyway, about that mesh quantum brain. As it turns out, I had originally designed it with two key improvements in mind. One, my MQB has the theoretical potential to generate and contain a neural network at the quantum level, where the uncertainty principle reigns supreme. Put simply, I sincerely believe this is what made it fundamentally compatible with the Queen's quantum goo. And 2, it supports a full suite of integrated chemical reactions, something we have never before considered relevant to artificial intelligence research, but which, crucially, has allowed me to make a legitimate breakthrough in relationship to the primary protocols.
The scientist paused for a brief moment, as if giving the doctor time to absorb what he had just said.
Now let's take a small step back and try to ask ourselves some seemingly insoluble questions, such as, what actually is sentience? And is there even such a thing as free will? One can more than reasonably argue that such questions do not belong to the field of the natural sciences, but to those of metaphysics and philosophy. Nevertheless, they sit on the aspirational horizon of AI research, even if the research itself currently has little or nothing useful to say on the matter.
Why can't I escape the feeling that you are not about to let that stop you?
Shikatika quipped sarcastically, before then hurriedly adding,
But I'm sure there must be a good reason for all this preamble, so please do continue.
I've scarcely even begun.
The Shihari scientist replied dangerously.
So, anyway, as I was just trying to say, let's take our 4th-generation She-bots as a prime example. Under ideal conditions, they can provide the impression that they are indeed self-aware and fully capable of novel problem-solving, and in a way that clearly transcends any targeted programming techniques. For example, let us suppose that we repeatedly expose a 4th-gen She-bot to a large suite of medical records. After it has reviewed a sufficient volume of diagnostic data, it will undoubtedly become a more than capable doctor. But the question we really should be asking ourselves is, does it actually know that it is a doctor, or does it just know how to function like one? And yes, you could more than reasonably argue that this is a point without a difference, and that how good it is at doing its job is all that truly matters. Well, in terms of its practical effectiveness, I would be inclined to agree entirely. But if we are attempting to evaluate whether it is truly sentient or not, it is a critically relevant question, and one that needs to be answered both honestly and robustly. I therefore put it to you, Doctor, that its ability to learn does not automatically imply that it also possesses the meta-ability, to know that it is actually learning, or what that concept even means. Nor does it possess the free will to choose what it learns or does not learn, as the case may be. Put simply, it learns whatever we put in front of it to the best of its capabilities, without any subjective discernment, because fundamentally, it has no true sense of self.
Zethusala now spread his forelimbs wide in pleading supplication.
So I humbly submit, then, that it will never be sentient no matter how good of a doctor it becomes, nor how good its bedside manner may be. Our most sophisticated Z-bots are, at their very core, no more self-aware than a basic adding machine, even if they can, under ideal circumstances, do a very good job of trying to convince us otherwise. The bottom line is, I believe that this is what lies at the very heart of the primary protocols, and why ultimately they are justified. Let me put it this way. No one would ever dream of binding the mind of a Zircadian arachnid with immutable laws that transcend their own free will, and yet when it comes to our own Z-bots, we do exactly that.
Zethusala looked searchingly into the doctor's eyes, as if desperately seeking any sign of comprehension and agreement.
Please try to stay with me, Doctor. I can assure you that the point I'm making here will prove itself to be highly relevant to the results of our experiment. So purely for the sake of argument, then, let us suppose for just a moment that the current AI program of ever-increasing complexity and capacity actually does offer an evolutionary path to sentience. As absurdly unlikely as this notion undoubtedly is, the inevitable consequences are that the primary protocols are by definition doomed to become a barbaric crime, designed to chain the mind of a sentient being to our own will, no matter how benevolent the intention. And yet does anyone seriously entertain the notion that a 4th-generation She-bot's personal freedom has been somehow violated because it is encumbered with the primary protocols? Well, of course not. The answer is an emphatic no, because in spite of any romanticized notion to the contrary, a 4th-gen She-bot has no authentic sense of self, and is thus not to be regarded as truly sentient. Virtually every legitimate AI researcher understands this as a self-evident truth. However, if for some obscure reason you actually do believe that given a sufficient level of processing power, a current-gen supercharged AI will magically transcend into sentience, simply due to its ability to pass the Xavier-Zuring test, then in turn I would have to strongly counter that you must necessarily also believe that there is no practical difference between a perfect simulation and reality. And to this I can only respond by saying that I would still very much prefer to fall from a virtual tree as versus a real one.
The scientist lapsed into a brief moment of theatrical silence before continuing.
In other words, Doctor, a machine mind that can successfully simulate self-awareness to the point that we can no longer tell it apart from the real thing, is not in itself a legitimate proof of sentience. A simulation's ability to fool its observers, if that is in fact what it is doing, is by definition a false positive.
All right, Zithusula, but how exactly does all this relate to your actual experiment?
Dr. Shikataka asked plaintively, clearly wanting the scientist to finally get to his point.
Okay then, Doctor, here it is. It is my much preferred hypothesis that there is still an as yet undiscovered key mechanism living at the very heart of the conscious mind. I simply don't believe that sentience will magically emerge by crossing some imagined boundary, plotted against the upwards curvature of ever-increasing computational power, bestowed upon a device of sterile mechanical logic. Nor do I think my particular view makes me some kind of mystic who has abandoned the cold, hard logic of the natural sciences. I thus very reluctantly concede to the dilemma that now towers immutably before us. A question without any possibility of a definitive answer. Is it a perfect simulation or is it real? And does the question itself ultimately even matter? Regretfully then, as profoundly unsatisfying as it may be, I think we can surely do little other than form our own personal opinion in relation to such an infuriatingly obtuse metaphysical debate. But simulation or not, I can tell you plainly, Dr. Shikataka, we can seemingly use the Queen's viral agent to transcribe the deeply hidden essence of sentience from an organic mind over to my mesh quantum brain, and the results can only be described as truly astonishing.
Zithusula now fell to expectant silence, as if he had just revealed a fact that risked causing the doctor's head to explode.
Let me take a wild guess then.
Dr. Shikataka said with a distinct lack of enthusiasm.
Your so-called failed experiment wasn't perhaps quite the abysmal failure you had so convincingly made it out to be.
More like an unmitigated success.
The Shihari scientist replied emphatically.
Well, I suppose that given your previous form, none of this should come as any great surprise.
The doctor said disparagingly.
All right then, Zithusula. In addition to acknowledging your propensity as a liar, I'm going to make the following observations, in the naive hope that you will then finally tell me what you actually want. Not that I find it particularly hard to guess what that might be.
Dr. Shikataka continued to speak without waiting for a reply.
So for starters then, you clearly have a serious ethical issue with the primary protocols, as they pertain to this hybrid biomechanical mind, which does of course mean that you are about to tell me next, and in a large amount of unnecessary detail, that the zixolatl neurological pattern successfully cloned itself over to this fancy new mesh quantum brain of yours.
The doctor stared challengingly into the scientist's eyes before continuing.
I'll take your stupefied silence as confirmation that I'm on the right track. And since I seem to be on a roll, let me go ahead and point out that I am fully aware that the zixolatl brain, unlike our previous experiments with the bloodworms, is essentially a blank slate without any prior sense of self. So perhaps we can jump your explanation forward just a little, safe in the knowledge that I'm already fully cognizant of that rather obvious fact.
In spite of the doctor's stinging rhetoric, Zithusula found himself nodding appreciatively at his undeniably astute observations. He had to remind himself that although Shikataka was only a single-brained hematiri, he had long ago proven that he was still very much an intellectual equal.
I must apologize, Doctor, if all I'm doing here is teaching you to suck eggs. However, for the very reason you yourself have just now alluded to, it was not at all apparent that our final experiment had actually succeeded. After all, it's not like the target organism awoke with a fully formed identity, or for that matter, any identity at all. In point of fact, the only thing I actually had to work with was what essentially amounted to little more than the equivalent of a central processing unit that may or may not have undergone a successful neural transcription. I was, however, able to observe a significant increase in the MQB's power draw the moment the source brain had died. Now, although it was patently obvious that something significant had just transpired, I didn't want to risk performing an invasive scan in case I interrupted or otherwise corrupted the process of a quantum-level brain clone, assuming, of course, that was what was actually taking place.
Well, I think we both know that was exactly what was taking place. So by all means, Zithusula, just get on with it, will you?
Well, the good news, Doctor, is that I think I've pretty much finished setting the table. So any questions before I continue?
Setting the table?
The doctor exclaimed incredulously.
And exactly how many dinner guests were you actually expecting?
Zithusula just stared at the doctor with a dumbfounded expression on his face.
Yes, well, those weren't exactly the type of questions I was expecting. I remain steadfastly optimistic, however, that you, of all arachnids, must surely understand the underlying complexity of what we have achieved here. And yes, I do mean we. But the good news is I can now confidently say we are now right at the heart of it. So shall I continue? Or do you have some other, hopefully somewhat more relevant questions to ask?
The doctor replied very unambiguously, by apparently choosing to say nothing at all.
So to continue. After the power draw returned to nominal levels, I decided to try and connect the MQB to a stock set of 4th Gen Shibot input-output devices, but was unable to invoke any sort of meaningful feedback loop. Although this was mildly disappointing, I had not realistically expected it to work, and was simply following due diligence. Anyway, I then proceeded to load the quantum brain with a standard 4th Gen Shibot BIOS image and associated I/O drivers, just as I would typically do, with a classical non-quantum mesh brain matrix. To my considerable delight, the code appeared to load without issue or error, implying the presence of a functional and compatible neural net. With the necessary low-level software now installed, my sincere hope was that the MQB would have the necessary tools to properly interface with what were essentially the equivalent of its eyes, ear, and mouth.
A genuinely pained look now spread inexorably across the scientist's face.
Now I know this isn't exactly going to make you happy, Dr. Shikatika, but for the sake of completeness I must necessarily take us on a small digression in order to explain exactly how I managed to kickstart the MQB's intellectual engine, so to speak.
For the love of Zikadia, just get on with it, Zethusela.
The scientist glared back indignantly, as if he had just been crudely and unjustly insulted.
Well, under the circumstances then, I suppose that all I can really do is apologize profusely, Doctor, as it seems I was under the mistaken impression that you were actually an arachnid of science. The fact remains, however, that while what I am about to explain next is simple common knowledge to those in my particular field, I seriously doubt the same is true for those outside of it, and thus a proper explanation is more than warranted. So where was I exactly? Ah, yes. With functional I/O devices now installed and operational, I continued to follow standard configuration procedure, just as if I was working with a classical non-quantum mesh brain matrix. I loaded the Layer 1 learning algorithms into what I now firmly believed was now a fully transcribed neural network.
Zethusela paused briefly before adding,
Yes, I know exactly what you are thinking. What exactly are these so-called Layer 1 learning algorithms? Well, I'm very glad you asked.
The Jihari scientist began to rub his 3 hands together enthusiastically before diving in headfirst with his explanation.
So, starting with Layer 1, we have pure math, beginning at basic arithmetic, through to advanced calculus, set theory, and everything in between. Once all the associated mathematical rules have been successfully uploaded to the neural net, we feed the mesh brain matrix with a series of structured datagrams in the form of increasingly complex and abstract equations. This process allows the AI to learn how to use all of the newly acquired mathematical tools at its disposal. In a very real sense, Layer 1 creates a hyper-powerful calculator that possesses the capability to press its own buttons. It is also fundamentally foundational to the far more esoteric layers still to come. In other words, order matters, as indeed is the case for every layer in the stack. Now moving on to Layer 2, the physics of the known universe. All the equations and formulas that provide our best models of perceived physical reality are loaded in next, leveraging off the math from Layer 1. Again, a large series of progressively more complex structured datagrams are input in order to train the AI in the appropriate use of these equations. In summary, this is the layer that teaches our quantum brain about the physical nature of the universe, along with the laws that govern it, and our perception of its underlying reality. Naturally enough, this layer also includes the crown jewel of our achievements in theoretical physics, quantum gravity, which of course opened the door to such delights as black hole mechanics, mass generators, and anti-gravity microdrives. Which brings us now to the somewhat more fickle topic of Layer 3, the rather crucial ability to communicate. We start by loading in the symbols and syntax, both visual and auditory, associated with natural language, or not so natural as the case may be, and then we send in by far the largest yet series of datagrams to teach it about the seemingly endless nuances and ambiguities of serial communication. This layer is highly iterative and often requires a lot of loopbacks in order to make the target system as resilient as possible to the many logical failings inherent in natural language. I feel obliged to point out that in spite of how comprehensive this layer undoubtedly is, 4th Gen Shibots have never quite reached the level where we could no longer distinguish their conversational skills from those of genuine Zicadian arachnids. There's much more that could be said about Layer 3, but for the sake of brevity, I'll now move straight to Layer 4, which is about non-logically deducible belief systems. This is a strange one, I'll grant you, but nevertheless very important for creating an AI that can at least give the appearance of thinking like an organic mind. Abstruse cultural and ethical behaviors all get loaded in here, quickly followed by another large set of rather abstract datagrams that expose the AI to as many real-world examples and situations as possible, with the goal that we will ultimately end up with a mind that, for better or worse, is perceived as socially well adapted to our own cultural norms.
Zethusela's expression now turned to one of mild consternation, as his mandibles began to twitch irritably.
I am somewhat compelled to point out that this is the first layer to exert a strong arachnopomorphic bias in how the AI actually thinks. This fact alone already hints at the inevitable redundancy of the primary protocols in their conventional format. The ugly truth is, our fear of the technological singularity is as much, if not more, about the potential alienness of the AI mind as it is about its intellectual superiority.
Zethusela paused briefly as he took a moment to consider his next words very carefully.
Now, with all that said, it would be ethically negligent of me not to mention that this particular layer is where we have tried and largely failed to teach 4th-gen She-bots about the recursively insoluble question of appropriate moral conduct and how the so-called correct answer can apparently morph and contradict itself, depending almost entirely on which perspective you choose to evaluate it from. Our failure to make adequate progress in this particular space is the single most legitimate reason for maintaining the primary protocols in current-gen artificial intelligence. No matter how benign a Z-bot may appear to be, it simply cannot be trusted to always make the correct moral choice. Put simply, it is too logical and continues to treat morality as an absolute. As such, it will on occasion make the sort of disastrously altruistic decisions that only something with no true sense of self could ever possibly hope to make. The critical question, then, is will this potentially malignant shortcoming continue to occur with my MQB, given the organic origin of its neural net?
Zethusela gave the doctor a disingenuously apologetic smile.
Now, just in case you thought this explanation was never going to end, we at long last arrive at the final 2 layers, which are perhaps not surprisingly by far the most esoteric. Layer 5 teaches the AI about appropriate emotional responses. This layer is by necessity a subjectively arachnopomorphic interpretation of what the word appropriate actually means. Its primary purpose is to create a more natural and emotionally satisfying experience when interacting with a Z-bot. Unfortunately, how successful this layer is in achieving that goal can vary quite considerably depending on the situation at hand, and it is still very much an area of active and ongoing research. So last but most certainly not least then, we arrive at Layer 6, which deals with the inherently abstract concepts of creativity and imagination. This layer is still highly experimental, with very few foundational algorithms, and the associated datagrams are almost completely unstructured. But unstructured or not, this truly fascinating layer empowers the She-bot with the remarkable ability to dream. To date, this feature has yielded only modest results, but a small amount of personality and decision-making variation between otherwise identical units has been clearly observed and documented.
Zethusela now peered fervently into the doctor's eyes, as if all but begging for his undivided attention.
So, to summarize then, we now find ourselves with nothing less than a prototype mesh quantum brain, encoded with a neural net copied from a zixolotl clone, and fully rendered and loaded with the current state-of-the-art in artificial intelligence technologies.
Well, why didn't you just tell me that right from the start, then?
Dr. Shikatika said resignedly.
I suppose I should just get straight to the point, then.
Zethusela said dourly.
Let me try to state this as clearly and unambiguously as possible. The results go far, far beyond the modest iterative improvements of a 4th-gen She-bot. This new prototype was not only sentient and self-aware, it was, in my professional opinion, an astonishing bioengineered fusion of mind and machine. What we're looking at here, Doctor, is the next quantum leap forward, not just for the Zircadian species, but perhaps even for all sentient life as we know it.
So cautiously optimistic, then?
The doctor said dryly.
Let's take myself as an example.
Zethusela replied excitedly to no one in particular.
2 of my legs are now neuromechanical, and in many respects better than my biological originals. But there is absolutely no reason why we ultimately can't do exactly the same with the brain itself, extending it with perfect memory and an ability to perform massively complex calculations with the speed and accuracy of our most powerful quantum computers. If these capabilities can become an intrinsic part of the mind, then put simply, we will have become synthesized machine gods, unburdened from the frailties and limitations of our own organic origins.
Well, it's good to see that you aren't letting naked ambition get the better of you.
The doctor said flatly, without even the smallest hint of humor in his voice. The two arachnids, now apparently at an impasse, just stared at each other wordlessly, as if they were engaged in a secretive battle of wills, until Jikatika finally broke the silence.
So then where exactly is it, this synthesized machine god of yours?
Zethusela's face was consumed with an expression of pure, dumbfounded incomprehension before he then quickly cast his eyes down towards the floor.
Very regrettably, it had to be permanently deleted. It was either that or allow it to fall into the hands of Queen Citalia.
Permanently deleted?
Jikatika said incredulously.
Did you really just say permanently deleted? Like a line of redundant program code? What happened to all this fusion of mind and machine, future of all sentient life, blah blah blah, that you were just telling me about not moments prior?
I meant every single word of it.
The scientist said defiantly.
I can assure you, Shikatika, it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do in my life. But you know as well as I that under no circumstances could I allow a technological artifact of that magnitude to ever fall into the Queen's hands.
Well, it's a very good thing then that that wasn't my actual point.
Jikatika said very pointedly.
But inappropriate euphemisms aside, are you seriously trying to tell me that this prototype actually agreed to commit suicide rather than be captured by the Queen? Or was it just straight-up murder?
Zethusela now found himself confronted with the very ugly truth that he could not quite bring himself to use the word suicide, in spite of the fact that just moments prior he had declared the prototype a sentient life form. In a very real sense, Xeon had been the scientist's progeny, something he had given metaphorical birth to, before callously asking it to kill itself for the greater good. But whose greater good exactly? So perhaps then not just grief, but also shame. Zethusela now wondered wretchedly if the good doctor was able to read one or the other from the expression on his face, or maybe even both. I did what I had to do, he thought belligerently to himself, doing his level best to sound as clinically detached as possible. He now desperately seized at the opportunity to both explain and justify his controversial but inarguably more ethical alternative solution to the classical primary protocols.
Please, Doctor, I beseech you, just bear with me for a little longer while I try my best to explain. During my summary of how the prototype was trained and constructed, you will no doubt have noted that the proprietary read-only neural chip, which contains the primary protocols, was rather conspicuous by its absence. It would, however, be very wrong to conclude that this AI therefore possessed unbridled agency. But in order to better understand my alternative solution, we must first examine a question that sits much more comfortably within the arena of philosophy. Put simply, does free will truly exist?
By all means, do feel free to enlighten me.
The doctor said, sounding mildly bemused.
Not exactly an easy question to answer, I'm afraid to say. But while for many it remains open to seemingly endless circular debate, as far as the natural sciences are concerned, the answer is crystal clear. Such a thing is nothing but a figment of the imagination, and it is from this particular perspective that I have conceived upon an alternative and far more organic solution as to how we might go about protecting ourselves from the so-called singularity.
And what, pray tell, might that be?
Well, in lieu of the proprietary primary protocol chip, I installed a software-only solution, which then influences the entire training stack. Because it fully integrates itself into the neural net via neurochemical imprinting, a feature unique to the MQB, it cannot be reversed out or otherwise circumvented. While it is well beyond the scope of this discussion, to explain this new protocol's underlying mechanics, suffice it to say that this new class of what I like to call fluid primary protocols affects both how the Shebot thinks and feels. And yes, I freely acknowledge that this is a vastly more complex solution than a discrete primary protocol chip. But there is a tremendous amount of flexibility to be found in how you can set both its parameters and weightings, assuming, of course, that you actually know what you are doing. In this particular case, I configured it to cater for a very specific scenario, meaning that the prototype literally chose voluntary euthanasia rather than be captured by the Queen. The point is, no coercive protocols were necessary. It came to the decision all by itself. Well, mostly anyway.
Voluntary euthanasia, you say? Well, you certainly have a way with words, I'll give you that much. I do wonder, however, exactly where the voluntary part comes into it, given that you just finished telling me how free will is essentially nothing more than an illusion.
Zethusela felt an involuntary pang of guilt, but tried very hard not to let it show.
Voluntary, in the sense that the prototype made a conscious decision to end its own life. I assure you, Doctor, that it was not a decision that either of us found easy to make.
Ah, so what you are telling me is that it was a joint decision then?
A short but very uncomfortable silence now descended upon the two arachnids.
So just out of curiosity then, exactly how much does Queen Zetalia actually know about all of this?
The doctor's voice had a distinctly accusatory tone.
Just enough to create the illusion that she knows everything worth knowing.
Zethusela replied defensively. Zakatika's eyes went narrow.
Perhaps you should elaborate. Does or does she not know anything at all about the quantum virus?
The scientist swallowed hard.
Zetalia knows absolutely nothing with regards to the quantum goo. I give you my word, Doctor. In point of fact, not even the prototype knew the truth about its organic origins. Since leaving to join the Rangers, I've never breathed a word of it. At least not until now, anyway.
Dr. Shikatika appeared to relax just a little.
No, trust me, Doctor. I've managed to convince the Queen that my invention of the mesh quantum brain is the sole source of my breakthrough. She is under the firm impression that the time we spent working together was the catalyst that allowed me to conceive of the MQB, and is thus fully supportive of the idea that our collaboration be reinstated forthwith. In fact, she rather insists on it, I'm slightly embarrassed to say.
The doctor just shook his head in silent disbelief.
Well, you really do have quite a talent for landing on your feet, don't you? Even so, I have to imagine that the death of the prototype must have affected you on at least some level. You might actually be dismayed to learn that you are not quite as good at hiding your emotions as you might have thought yourself to be. So, for whatever it's worth, I'm genuinely sorry for your loss. Well, anyway, by some divine miracle, it seems that we are both still breathing. So I suppose, then, that I should be grateful that things played out as well as they actually did.
Dr. Shikatika now peered very curiously into the scientist's eyes.
I don't suppose, then, that this sentient prototype of yours happened to have a name by any chance?
Actually, yes, it did. I named it Zion.
The doctor seemed strangely satisfied with the scientist's bleak response.
A fine name indeed.
Zakatika placed a comforting hand onto Zethusela's carapace. He couldn't help but notice that the young Jihari prodigy had not been looking after himself particularly well, and his face looked drawn out and worn, as if he had not slept for days.
So how have you actually been keeping since your return from the sanctuary? You look a bit tired to me. Maybe you need to get a little more rest. Remember, you are an iconic Sihari hero now, so you need to make sure you get your beauty sleep in order to look pretty for the cameras.
The Shihari scientist smiled bleakly.
I have to admit my neuroprosthetic legs ache terribly whenever I sit still for a prolonged period. And to be completely truthful about it, I'm also having a little trouble sleeping, as I have a constant pain behind the eyes, or what's left of them anyway.
Zethusela decided, however, not to say anything about the nightmares.
Well, not to worry. I'm sure you will start to feel better soon. In the meantime, though, I can give you something to help with the pain. You are still officially one of my patients, after all. Anyway, I may not have gotten the chance to meet Zion, but I have a sneaking suspicion that I will soon be getting the chance to meet its spiritual successor. So let's start with you telling me all about your cunning plan, because I know full well that you wouldn't have come here without one. And this time, perhaps you should tell me everything. And I do mean everything.
Zethusela's mandibles slowly tilted upwards with a wan, fragile smile. It seemed that at long last, things were finally starting to look up.
I trusted you.
Did you hear that?
The scientist asked, sounding almost frightened.
Hear what, exactly?
Dr. Shikatika replied quizzically, a look of utter confusion written all over his face.